Hello, everyone. We are today here with Dr. Bastiaan Willems, who is a postdoctoral fellow of modern European history at the University College London, and he recently published his book, Violence and Defeat, the Wehrmacht on German Soil. Welcome, Bastiaan.
Thank you.
And today we will look at the question, why not just surrender? Basically, German commanders in 45, why didn't they just surrender? For some, this might be a less smart question, but actually when I was reading in Bastiaan's book, there was one case I never encountered so far, which was quite interesting, but we'll discuss basically three cases. The first one, of course, is what most people might be aware of, that the certain commanders faced the so-called Sippenhaft, that their family would also be prosecuted. So can you elaborate on one of these cases with Sippenhaft?
So Sippenhaft literally means taking into captivity your Sippe, and your Sippe is an old German word for your family. So Sippenhaft really means family punishment. So this was a threat that was very readily invoked in the last year of the war to some commanders, to some German commanders, who basically knew that if they were to surrender, their family would be taken prisoner. Of course, this is on itself not enough of a reason to explain why the Germans kept fighting for the time they did, and the commanders kept fighting for the time they did. But in my case, it is important to point out, like I'm examining Festung Königsberg, the fortress of Königsberg. There, the commander, General Otto Lasch, is threatened by this. And once he surrenders, and he really only surrenders at the very last minute when the Soviets are already at his bunker, like he surrenders, his family is taken prisoner. Like his daughter at this time, who I interviewed a few years ago, is actually taken becomes a prisoner and is held captive by the Gestapo as a threat. And this happened to some commanders in the final stage of the war.
So did they actually determine that he was surrendering that basically at the last minute and she got freed again, or was this of no concern? He was basically the order, he has to die with his troops.
He was supposed to die, preferably, but at least he was not supposed to surrender. That is the most important thing. Like whether you survive is up to you to some extent, but you cannot surrender your entire force, and that is what the German High Command thought what happened. Of course, radio contact has been lost at the final stage of the siege of Königsberg. So the Red Army starts storming the city on April 6th, 1945. And by April 8th, it becomes very hard after that to signal messages out of Königsberg. So at this point, the city goes dark as far as Berlin commanders are concerned. So also, Hitler and the High Command don't really know what is happening. So now imagine it's the 10th of April 1945. So 2 days you've heard nothing. And now on Soviet radio, which of course the German High Command is also listening to for information, they hear Königsberg has surrendered, the garrison has been taken prisoner, and we're victorious. They hear this message and they go, oh, so General Lasch must have surrendered, and let's take now his family a prisoner. And that is what ends up happening. And Lasch knows that this is happening. He learns this from his Soviet captors, that his family has been taken prisoner, because a few days later, they do announce that on the radio. The German military command announces on the radio, Lush has cowered in a very cowardly way, they say on the radio, has surrendered his city, and his family has been taken a prisoner. And of course, like Soviet commanders reflect on that, and they show in his memoirs, in their memoirs, that Lush is like obviously very, very upset about this. So these are just different ways. Like Siepenhaft is not, of course, the only way to prevent people from surrendering. Also, like more well known are the cases where people who carry white flags, for example, like you can no longer surrender at the final point of the war, like if like the use of a white flag is being forbidden. So there are actually quite a lot of ways in which the German army tries to prevent people from surrendering. And like Siepenhaft is one of the most egregious one, I'd say, egregious ones in that. Siepenhaft is really one of the most challenging ones in this respect, because it is such a like a personal thing. I think the German army was very well aware that surrendering is not something you do with a group, but it's a personal decision. And by making this a personal matter, they can really discourage commanders from surrendering. Of course, in the very final stage of the war, this becomes less and less important, because less and less German territory is still in German hands. So a lot of the family of the people who surrender are already, for example, in British hands or in American hands. So this threat becomes a little bit less as the war draws to a conclusion. But especially in the earliest months of 1945, this is still a very real threat. And even though we don't have direct evidence that says if you surrender, your family goes into Siepenhaft, it is something that German commanders are aware of that might happen.
Okay, so the other example is, or the other situation is, and probably the best known is, that if one tries to surrender and something fails, he's obviously executed. I think this happened at Gotha. Could you give us a brief example of this?
Yeah, you have the battle commander of the German town of Gotha, who does actually surrender to the American troops. There are actually cases, Gotha is not even the only one where this happens, where German commanders, they look at the situation and they judge it correctly, and they go, good, defending this city would lead to absolutely nothing. It would only lead to high German casualty numbers. If we were to defend the city somewhere, if we were to defend an area outside of the city, it would be a much better defense. So rather than fighting for the city, let's surrender the city itself, retreat a little bit, for example, into the nearby hills, or can be wherever, like better positions, military defensive positions, and let's fight there. Of course, this still means that you're now surrendering your city, and this means that you get punished by, that you get sentenced to death. This is what happens in Gotha, where the German military commander surrenders, and then a day later, German military court sentences him to death, and he is executed. But he does, as a result, end up saving the city of Gotha, which is why Gotha is more intact than, for example, nearby cities.
So, and the final example, and this is the one I was not aware of before I read it in your book. In this case, a commander wanted to surrender, but his troops mutinied and they continued to fight on. I think this was the 5th Panzer Division.
Yeah, I think in this lies the core of why German soldiers fought. Like all these reasons that we have named up to this point are basically also after the war used as excuses. Like we were being terrorized by our high command, and as a result, we couldn't surrender. This is a very convenient excuse, if you will, because you can now pass the blame to someone else. And that's what very often happened. But what we see even more is that the deep need to keep fighting, which is became so deeply ingrained also in the years before, the idea that you as a German people are being threatened, this has become so pervasive in the entire German military, and everyone, of course, believes this, especially if you're a soldier and you have been on the Eastern Front since, let's say, 1941. You haven't heard anything else for 4 years straight than if you surrender, Germany collapses into chaos. So a lot of soldiers, especially of the more battle-hardened divisions, such as in this case the 5th Panzer Division, they truly believe that surrendering means Germany will die, Germany will go under, German culture will be lost, and they really, in their heart of hearts, do not see that they are currently contributing to the destruction themselves. For them, helping defend a city or helping defend an area, the fact that this area is now completely destroyed is irrelevant. What is important to them is that they continued until the very last to what they consider like a very worthy cause, namely like the defense of Germany. That at this point, the German people and German civilians, of course, in particular, just prefer to stay alive, was something that they considered less and less. And people who wanted to surrender, they were always cowards and always traitors to the German nation. So you get into this narrative, which is very persistent among German troops, that just thinking about surrendering, thinking about stopping the fight is considered to be traitorous behavior. So treacherous behavior. And as a result, there are a lot of units who are just completely unwilling to surrender. And this is especially present among veterans. And as you perhaps know, a division, if you have a division and it is destroyed, what you're now left with, of course, are a few veterans. So if you build up this division again, you now have the veterans who now are starting to occupy the main places. So you have non-commissioned officers, you have good officers who might have survived. And these are now the hardened men. And this is what you build your division around. So these are the men who now are calling the shots. And these are the men who say, we have to keep fighting. And especially younger and newer recruits, they would listen to them. They obviously also don't have that much of a choice in that respect. And they very soon start to internalize this behavior. And as a result, you see that German units fight on very, very long. And the will to keep fighting among the German military is consistently higher than the will among the German people on the home front themselves.
So the mutiny thing, do you know of any other unit where this happened in this case?
We have units in Königsberg, most famously the 69th Infantry Division, who also just did not want to surrender. And what happens in Königsberg is, even though Lush signs the surrender document, in this document he also says it is the task of the Red Army to get rid of people who want to continue fighting. So he doesn't really surrender the city, he just basically surrenders the people around him, so it's really not a capitulation of the city at all. And in his memoirs, he actually does stress this, and so do his immediate superiors. And so do the people in his staff. They would after the war say this was not a wholesale surrender. He just surrendered the people that he could reach. But again, the radio is broken. They were working at that point already with couriers. So a courier has to make his way through the positions, and this was all very, very cumbersome. So he says, I will surrender and I will go into captivity, but you cannot expect me to report or have other units surrender. So we'll see that in the days following Königsberg's surrender, there are still very large units that just keep fighting. And at some point, the German high command actually manages to send a little plane over Königsberg. And this plane even sees that that units are still fighting, and this can be observed even from like by plane. So this is how big the group of fighting still is. It's not that once General Lush surrenders that the fighting just stops. It continues a lot. Like we tend to think only, okay, it's only the fanatical SS that keeps fighting, which is also the case in Königsberg. There's also SS units that keep fighting, but also just regular units that keep fighting. They believe in their heart of hearts, if we surrender to the Bolsheviks, we will die. And so therefore we do not surrender. And as a result, like it's a sort of a vicious circle, of course, because they don't surrender, like they are considered to be hardliners. And as a result, if they're taken prisoner, they are now treated harder than people who surrendered earlier. So
yeah, so it's in a way it's a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Yeah, exactly.
And was there, do you know any how many even believed that they might achieve like something like the Endsieg, a final victory? Because I mean, some of these German soldiers were, of course, they were like basically in the front of the gates of Moscow in 1941. Then, I mean, they were also maybe part of Case Blue. And then they saw that they might think that at one point the Red Army might run out of steam, like the Wehrmacht did run out of steam. Were there still some that believed that, or was this completely gone at this point?
I'd say most of it is gone, but there is something that is quite often overlooked, is that the fact that what soldiers tended to do then is that they say, like, I don't see a path to final victory anymore. But who am I to question the high command? I'm only a small soldier. I'm not supposed to see the larger picture. I'm fighting because the high command is telling me to keep fighting. I shouldn't be thinking about final victory at all. That is not my task. I am a lowly soldier. Don't let me think about final victory. If the high command says final victory will come, maybe I don't see it. Like, but who am I to judge? Like, I'm not a great strategic thinker. The only thing that is at this point expected of me is to keep fighting. So this means that even if you don't yourself personally believe in final victory, you're still very willing to fight for that final victory.
Yeah, so this comes also down to what sometimes is portrayed the Germans, that they do their duty mostly and very, very consciously in a way.
Yeah, the concept of duty, like this is like the Germans are very proud of it. Like Immanuel Kant writes a lot on like the concept of duty and like duty to the state, and like these are like deep philosophical thinkings, like dating back to the Enlightenment. What Nazi Germany does is they completely hollow the concept of duty out. Like nothing remains of like any pure form of duty, as like let's say Immanuel Kant thinks about it. To them, it just means working to achieve victory. So the idea of duty becomes this completely unsophisticated thing, like without, like you're not supposed to reflect on anything. Your duty is duty to the state. And they will portray this as something being like completely German and like centuries old, but obviously what they do with it is completely hollowing it out of any true like meaning. And at the end of the war, it just means listening to what the state is saying and don't question it.
So in a way, you I think you have there a very good parallel, especially in the military, because the German army was especially known for mission command. So basically Auftragstaktik, that you get a mission, but they don't tell you how to fulfill it. And during the Second World War, you can see a decrease in that. And in the end, it becomes just basically following orders to a certain degree, which was actually counter to that was the German army was well known for. So you basically have it at that point as well, probably. So that might be directly linked in a way with that hollowing out of the Pflicht.
Yeah, we still see a little bit of mission tactics or Auftragstactics in East Prussia as well. Like, for example, Operation West Wind, which sought to connect Königsberg with Pillau. General Lasch, the commander, is told allocate a division and a half, roughly, to the breakout out of Königsberg. He goes beyond that. He looks at his mission and he says, a division and a half would not be sufficient. And he decides to allocate a full 3 divisions, really, to this operation, with one extra basically on standby. And even though his superior commanders really are quite angry at him for doing that, and it makes indeed very little sense, because he leaves at this point the city completely undefended, really. Like, the entire city at this point is defended by 2 very worn out divisions, which is completely insufficient. But he still does it. And here you see that he does still try to adhere to the concept of Auftragstaktik, mission tactics. So it does still happen even at the final stage of the war, but it no longer requires the same sort of like creative thinking that it was in the First World War and in, let's say, the Franco-Prussian War.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bas.
Very welcome.
I hope you learned something new here, because I definitely did. And thank you for watching, and see you next time. Bye.